Welcome everybody. Today is obviously an opportunity for us to have a conversation about the Specialisation Verification Framework, and in particular, what to be thinking about in terms of specialisation verification in regards to working with people who identify as care leavers. This is certainly not detailed diversity training about care leavers, but we're really lucky to have a panel of experts and people with lived experience here with us today to really help, I hope, remind us about the experience of people who identify as care leavers and why it's so important for us as service providers to understand those experiences, regardless of whether, I guess, you pursue specialisation or not, but to be able to understand what some of the key issues might be and what we're going to be talking about. So we're going to be looking at it very big picture. There are lots more resources to support you with that more in-depth education along the way. We will look today at what the Specialisation Verification Framework is all about. Very briefly talk through the process of applying for specialisation and how that works. Most importantly, the best part of these sessions is that we have an opportunity to have a panel discussion as well. Before we launch in, I'd really like to introduce you to today's panel. We have Bev, Frank, Sarah and Valadia joining us today to support us in this conversation. I might ask each of you, if it's okay, just to give us a really brief introduction about who you are and why you're here as part of our panel today.
My name is Bev Murray. I'm the Program Manager at Link Up Victoria, which is a program of the Victorian Aboriginal Childcare Agency, a statewide Aboriginal community organisation. I've been with Link Up since 2010, and our service is all about supporting the stolen generations who reside here in Victoria. We provide research around connections, we provide reunions. We're the only service that is funded to do reunions. We do reunions all over Australia, from the smallest remote communities to big cities. We produce resources, organise events to commemorate days of significance to the stolen generation, so the National Apology in February and National Sorry Day in May.
There are Link Up services available in each state across Australia. So within the resource list as well, we'll include the links to those resources as well. Thank you for being here, Bev.
I grew up a long time ago in orphanages, foster care, from the age of 2 to 15. I've become a member of CLAN from the outset. CLAN is a national advocacy and support group for care leavers, which has been going for 23 years. In real life, I'm an historian, researcher and author.
A really fantastic blend, Frank, of lived experience yourself, growing up in orphanages and foster care, but also having done that ongoing work and advocacy. So thank you for being here today, Frank.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm on the land of the Yagara and the Turrbal people in Yanton, Brisbane, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge First Nations people on this call, and the particular relevance of the topic at hand for First Nations children who are taken from families and communities. So I have various hats in relation to the care leaver space. I'm not a person with lived experience, but I've worked in the not-for-profit sector over the last decade, really travelling very closely with the Royal Commission into institutional responses to child sexual abuse, and for one of the largest not-for-profit community services agencies in the country. And for the last 4.5 years, I've been the National Director of the redress entity for a large church. I'm part-time in that role now, and that means that I can use that experience and knowledge that I have of the system to pick up projects like this incredible work that Helping Hand has done in the Real Care the Second Time Around project, and the development of those resources that were co-designed with Forgotten Australians and care leavers. I'm also chair of the Ford Foundation here in Queensland, so we deliver micro grants for Forgotten Australians and care leavers to help them with their ongoing needs in their life, often related to their experiences as children in care.
If anyone is not familiar yet with the resources that have been created as part of the Real Care the Second Time Around project, I would highly recommend them to you. They're really fantastic resources for staff working in this space to better understand not only the experience of care leavers, but also understanding how we as organisations can better support people with that experience. So thank you, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Valadia Cooper. I identify as a Forgotten Australian. From the age of birth up until 15, I spent time in orphanages, mental health and foster care. And I'm here today hoping that I can share some of my lived experience, so that people will understand the needs of Forgotten Australians, care leavers.
I know you will absolutely be able to do that today. In our conversations so far, Valadia's insights and experiences have been really valuable, certainly to my understanding. And I think regardless of whether everybody here today pursues specialisation verification, learning from our panel today is an amazing opportunity to start that conversation and think about, your service, what you might want to continue to learn more about. All right, let's launch in and have a look at why we're here and how the Specialisation Verification Framework has come about. Sure, everybody is very aware that we all have a responsibility as providers to be able to demonstrate that we're equipped to deliver safe and inclusive services for all older people, and that lots of work has been done to be able to strengthen our work in this space. As part of the Royal Commission into Aged Care, really they identified that right across our sector, we need to be getting better at delivering safe and inclusive services for all Australians, and not only recognising the diversity within older people, but really embracing that and putting dedicated effort and focus into making sure that we think about the diversity in our community as part of our ongoing planning, the way that we design services, and certainly the way that we deliver them. Those responsibilities are embedded into our aged care quality standards. We have the Aged Care Diversity Framework, and a number of other documents that support that. I'm sure everybody's aware that the Aged Care Act and the quality standards are currently being reviewed, and certainly the drafts that have been released really strengthen those responsibilities, and in some places more specifically or explicitly describe our responsibilities in regards to responding to diversity in our community. Within the Aged Care Act, there are 9 special needs groups that are identified. I want to acknowledge that the terminology special needs groups is in and of itself not very inclusive, and certainly within the revision of the Aged Care Act, hopefully that terminology, special needs groups, will disappear. However, that's what we have at the moment. But really what it describes is recognising that while all older Australians can experience challenges and difficulty accessing and using our system, there are a number of people who might face additional barriers or challenges in terms of using services that are a good fit for them. So within the Aged Care Act, there are these 9 special needs groups that are identified, and care leavers, Forgotten Australians, are part of that group. I want to acknowledge as well, just while we're here, that within the special needs groups, we're obviously going to be focusing on talking about care leavers today. One of the groups within care leavers is identified as survivors of the stolen generations. More broadly, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples are also identified as a special needs group as well, so there is some overlap there. We know that about a third of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples today are survivors of the stolen generations. So it is important to be thinking about the unique and special needs of that group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, as well as more broadly understanding the experience of our First Nations peoples. We are obviously going to be focusing on talking about care leavers today, but I want to acknowledge up front that we don't work with characteristics or specific experiences. We work with whole people. So someone's experience as a care leaver is going to be one part of their experience and what shapes their identity, but that comes along with a lifetime of experience that sits alongside that. So when we think about the evidence in terms of understanding the needs of care leavers, everyone's experience is going to be different. Each characteristic or aspect of our identity and each experience that we have absolutely shapes who we are, but it doesn't define who we are because it sits alongside all of these other parts of our identity and experience as well. Just want to recognise that up front, that when we talk about the evidence, we're thinking big picture, but we don't work big picture, we work with individuals. So in order to understand what's going to work with any one person, we need to be talking to that one person about their experience and what's important to them. In terms of the Specialisation Verification Framework, this was introduced as part of the response to the Royal Commission recommendations, and it was developed by AHA in consultation with consumers, service providers and experts in the space to be able to more objectively have a process where aged care providers could demonstrate that they are equipped and are really going above and beyond to deliver safe and inclusive services for people who identify with the special needs groups identified in the Aged Care Act. What used to happen was that when somebody was searching for an aged care provider, they could look up the Find a Provider tool, and each organisation could just self-nominate what they considered themselves to be an expert in terms of delivering care to different people. Now, what the Royal Commission has said is that it's really important for that information to be validated and for organisations to be able to provide evidence that actually backs up that they walk the walk in terms of delivering that safe and inclusive care. So the Specialisation Verification Framework includes specific criteria that organisations need to meet to be able to demonstrate that they're doing that work. And we will talk through briefly at the end today what those criteria are and how you provide that evidence. I guess I just want to remind everybody that some of you might be ready and raring to go in terms of pursuing specialisation verification, which is fantastic, and we'll talk about some of the benefits of that. Even if your organisation is not ready to pursue verification at the moment, understanding the framework is really valuable. It really is useful to get a baseline understanding of what good practice looks like in terms of supporting our diverse communities, and could really help you guide your quality improvement process along the way. So even if you're not ready at the moment to pursue verification, I think it's a really valuable tool to better understand. So we'll talk a bit about that. One of the key benefits, I guess, of specialisation is that it allows you to demonstrate to the community and promote yourself as an organisation as being equipped to deliver specialised care. The key difference, therefore, is that when you go on and search for a provider on the Find a Provider tool, somebody can search specifically to see if an organisation is a good fit for them by looking at the specialisations that they might offer. So when someone goes into search for a provider, they can look for what type of care that they're looking for, and then they can refine that search with a number of different filters. And this first one, specialised care, is the one that relates to Specialisation Verification Framework. You can also search for organisations that provide services for people with specific health needs, which might be, for example, working with people with dementia, be able to deliver services in different languages or that are appropriate for people with different faiths. And those things are not included in the Specialisation Verification Framework. It is just this first one in terms of specialised care. So you can then filter according to each of the special needs groups. And when you do that, you can actually look to see what people are verified for and how they went about achieving that specialisation. So at the moment, there are actually no providers that are verified to deliver care for people who identify as care leavers. So I'm showing you here instead an example where SMRC is verified as delivering services for culturally and linguistically diverse people. Then when you look at that, you can see which services are included in their verification and which criteria they use to meet that verification. So as a community member or an assessor looking to make a referral, they can actually go in and have a look at who's verified and with what criteria. So they really, hopefully, will be much better equipped to make an informed decision about picking an organisation that might be a good fit for them. There are lots of different benefits of being verified. Certainly for older people and the community more broadly, being able to feel confident that you can approach a service that is a good fit for you and know that an organisation is equipped and doing that work to deliver safe and inclusive services is really important. We've also heard some feedback from a number of different older people through these sessions and more broadly about the fact that when they have searched, it has made them feel more confident when they have found verified providers, and conversely, when they've searched, they haven't found providers that are verified, that it has created some anxiety for people that perhaps nobody is equipped to be able to deliver support that's right for them. So that's a good reminder as well, I guess, about the value on the ground for our consumers. It's also not just older people that use the Find a Provider tool. Certainly lots of support people or, people more broadly in the community that are supporting people to access care absolutely use the Find a Provider tool. But it's also a really important source of information for assessors when they're making referrals. So it helps them choose the right services that are right for the people that they're working with. As a service provider, obviously the flow-on effect from that is being able to receive referrals that are appropriate and recognise the work that you're doing in that space, really highlighting and actively communicating to the community the work that you are doing in terms of delivering inclusive care and the work that you're doing to make sure that you're equipped to understand and respond to the diversity in your local community. Can be really helpful, obviously, for promoting your service and really recognising what your point of difference is so that people can choose you as the best fit for them. More broadly, I think understanding that benchmark about what inclusive practice looks like and what steps all providers can be taking to work towards inclusive services is really valuable for everybody, regardless of whether you're ready to pursue verification or not right now. So let's look specifically at care leavers. Certainly in my work, this is the diversity characteristic that I think in terms of language can be perhaps most confusing, and that lots of people are not familiar with or not as aware of who care leavers might be and what that term actually includes or relates to. So there are about 500,000 Australians who would be considered as a care leaver. And that definition really includes anybody who spent time in out-of-home care as a child, so before the age of 18. Within that group of care leavers, we include forgotten Australians, former child migrants. So there were about 7,000 children that arrived in Australia, primarily from the UK and Malta, and were often sort of, their family was coerced into having that child removed from their family. They came and were forced to work in Australia. And we have survivors of the stolen generations as well within that group. And there are another group of people who are often young mums who had their children removed from them via forced adoption, who then went into the foster care system themselves as well. So both their children and parents sometimes became care leavers themselves as well. While each of these experiences might be very different and have come about because of public policies that we had, certainly for survivors of the stolen generations, those policies had been around since the 1800s and continued right to the 1970s. However, for Forgotten Australians, there were public policies and practices in our community from sort of the 1940s to 1970s, which meant that a lot of children were removed from their families and placed into care. While each of those experiences might be really different, those children were removed from their families, disconnected from their community, culture, everything around them that was important. And so there are some similarities in there, which is why we have this broader group of care leavers. While we're here, I think one of the things that is really important to note, I guess, is that the language and terminology around care leavers can be a bit inconsistent and potentially a bit unhelpful at times. Frank, I was wondering if I could ask you around the terminology of care leavers and if you might be able to shed some light on that conversation.
Yes, the term Forgotten Australians came out of the 2004 Senate inquiry into children in institutional care, and they used that title, that term, Forgotten Australians, as the title of that publication. So over the years, it's lost traction. A lot of people don't understand the term. They understood it at the time when that report was being publicised and used a great deal. But since then, I think people scratch their heads, often not knowing what the term means. The other problem with the term Forgotten Australians is that it's used a great deal by other groups who feel that they are being sidelined or not given the recognition of their needs and problems. And thirdly, I think the adjective forgotten really is a fairly limp summary of the experience of many children who lived in orphanages, children's homes, missions, foster care, and so on. Many were abused, many were neglected, and those experiences are much more powerful than being forgotten. So Care Leavers Australasia Network doesn't use the term Forgotten Australians, but it recognises that many of its members do still use that term. So we just go with the flow. If I were talking to someone about my experiences, I wouldn't use either of those two terms, to be quite honest, Forgotten Australians or care leavers. I'd actually say I grew up in an orphanage, or I grew up in foster care, or I grew up in a mixture of those things. It's much more descriptive and upfront, and people understand the language you're using. But, when we're in a forum like this, I think we can use both terms, Forgotten Australians and care leavers, quite usefully without too much concern. I must just say that 500,000 Australians figure that you cite on the sheet there, it was the number that Senate in 2004 estimated grew up in care between the years about 1930 to 1980. And we've got to remember that this is an issue that's continuing on. We have record numbers of children in out-of-home care as we speak. So that it's not just an historical problem. And if you go back to colonial times, that figure of 500,000 is far too few.
I really hear what you're saying in terms of this is not just a historical issue. It is continuing, and there's a lot more work to be done in this space for young people as well. And certainly for older people, I think while the figure of 500,000 might actually underrepresent people, we know that but people who were in out-of-home care during that period that you spoke about, that number of people are becoming or are eligible for aged care services right now. So we know that there are about 4.5 million Australians aged over 65. And that doesn't include the fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can access aged care services from the age of 50 or 45 if they also experience homelessness or significant disadvantage. So if we think about that as a number, a really significant number of older people are considered care leavers, whether they use that terminology or not. And so this is not a occasional kind of thing that organisations might need to be thinking about. We will all be working with people who have had that experience of out-of-home care. So it's something really important for all providers to understand and be aware of, and perhaps even more so than that number indicates. Bev, I was just wondering if there was anything that you wanted to speak about in terms of care leavers as a term potentially, or survivors of the stolen generation and the different language and terminology and sort of identification that people might relate to.
Interesting, isn't it, the terminology that's used, and then over time it gets changed because people start to really think about how they want to refer to themselves as. So I really understand what you're saying there, Frank. Same experience with stolen generations. In the beginning, they were referred to as members of the stolen generations, and then our mob said, well, no, being a member implies that you chose to be there, you chose that life, and we know that no one chose to be a stolen generations. So the correct terminology is stolen generation or stolen generation survivors or survivors of the stolen generations, never members.
I think that's a really good starting point. And I guess I would just reinforce that in terms of being staff working in an aged care space, it's not up to us to determine what language is appropriate. I would lead with exactly what Frank and Bev just alluded to, which is just ask people what language works for them or the way that they describe their experience, and that's the language that we should be using. We have this broad term of care leavers that we use in the system, but like with everything else in the system, that is just the jargon that we use to describe really complex experiences and really different experiences for different people. So at an individual level, just be guided by the person about what makes sense to them and what they're comfortable with. In terms of working with care leavers, again, this is a very complex issue that I have summarised into one slide with far too many words on it. However, I just wanted to highlight, I guess, that people who have had experiences of out-of-home care are recognised as a special needs group in the Aged Care Act, because we recognise that that experience can really have a significant impact on people's experience of ageing and their health and well-being over time, and also what is required to deliver safe and inclusive care for those people. So absolutely. Again, while each of the groups within that broad category of care leavers might have had very varied experiences, those commonalities of really significant trauma, and Frank spoke before about the abuse and neglect that many care leavers experience, separation from family and communities and culture, and the long-lasting impacts of that on individuals. Many care leavers weren't afforded the opportunity of education or healthcare, both in terms of physical healthcare, but even things like dental care, which has a really significant impact on health over time, and certainly that lack of support and nurturing and affection, etc. Sarah, I was wondering if you might be able to speak really briefly to those longer term impacts of someone's experience in out-of-home care in terms of what we need to be thinking about as people get older.
We're learning more and more about this as research is done. And what is known, again, speaking in generalities, is that people experience premature aging and that they can be very reluctant to access aged care support. And then sometimes that might mean reluctance to allow people to come into their homes to provide community-based care, which can then mean that that it kind of gets to a crisis point and people might end up then having to go straight into residential care. And going back into that institutional environment can be deeply traumatizing for people. And there can be a real and genuine fear of having to losing control. And that in many cases people have worked their whole lives to create safety around themselves and whatever that looks like for them, to go back into an environment where they're reliant on other people for care, where they can be told what time and what they're going to eat, where they lose control and choice around how they're cared for. And so that's the opportunity that we have to help educate aged care providers, people providing services, as to what are the things that we can do to make people feel more safe in the environment, to speak to them individually, create trust so that they feel comfortable in disclosing a history of care, and then what that means for them. Because of course it's really can be very sensitive and very difficult time of their lives for people to discuss.
Sarah brought up something very important just then, and it was around the control. And I've spent all my life trying to be as independent as possible and not seek help because of the trust factor. And right to the point where even driving, I don't like being a passenger, and in public transport, things like that. And I've had to have a lot of work with a psychiatrist over that. So that control is the whole thing that just completely blows out when it comes to aged care, is not having your own identity and say on things. I was also I had very little education in the system. So learning about things has been extremely difficult, especially when people say things and I've had to ask them to repeat. And quite often I've had them get a bit, short with me, and because here I am, a grown person who should understand that. So, yeah, there's many, many difficulties.
I know you shared with Sarah and I recently a really great example that I think highlights the importance of understanding what's important to each person. And that was your experience in terms of managing medications. I was wondering if you might be willing to share that story.
The first institution I was in, they made it a habit of testing immunisations on the children. And I have no idea how many I've had, but quite a lot. And there was occasion where I felt very, very sick, or I've passed out. I've seen other children pass out on the floor and become extremely sick. And I do worry, because I think other children may have passed away. I never saw the kids again. So my growing up, my health suffered both mentally and physically, because I had an extreme fear of taking medication. For years I suffered terribly, until the point where I actually spoke to the doctor, and I said, I can't take this medication. You're writing me a script, but I literally can't take it. I will go home and throw the script in the bin. So, and I've had a lot of work there. I've had a psychiatrist actually make me take my medication while I was sitting there and wait, 15, 20 minutes or whatever until I felt confident that I wasn't going to die. So in the services, understanding that and I would like someone to be able to sort of, if I had to have medication, would be to sit with me until I felt safe enough for them to leave. Yeah. So now if I take new medication, I've finally worked out what to do, and I've spoken to my local doctor's surgery, and I can't say all of them are so caring, but this one is, and they're quite happy for me to come up there, go to the chemist, get my medication, come and sit there and have it and read a book or annoy the staff ladies or whatever for 15, 20 minutes until I feel confident.
Two things really stand out to me about that. One is your resilience and resourcefulness to have come up with a solution that works for you in terms of, recognizing now that taking those medications is really important. And so you've found a way that you can feel safe in that. The other thing that I think is really important for providers to be thinking about is that if we asked you what was really important and what you need from staff, if people knew that what you need is all of the information so that you feel confident about making that choice, and if it's medication specifically, then having a safe space to have that medication where you can have that supervision to feel confident, that's actually a really easy thing for staff to be able to deliver. That's not complex, that's not expensive, that doesn't require a huge amount of resources. If we just asked you that question up front, what do you need, and gave you the space, you already know the answer, and it's something that we could deliver. We don't need to understand all of the background of your experience and why those things are important. We just need to know to ask you the question and then respect that and deliver. Bev, I was wondering if you might be able to speak to some of the challenges that people might experience in terms of going back to work with institutions and services and know that a service is going to be safe and appropriate and inclusive for them.
I guess I need to talk about in the Aboriginal community what the preferences are for aged care, yeah? So for our mob, I want to be looked after at home, yeah? But of course we know that's not possible once there are some major health issues that makes that not possible. So then the next option for us is our own services. That's why we have all services in all different areas, from health to education and aged care. We've got a fantastic aged care service here in Melbourne. There's only one, yeah. So we know we either need to get some more, or we need to look at making sure mainstream aged care services can look after our mob in the way our mob need to be looked after. And for us, it's about making sure that we are acknowledged as Aboriginal people, that our culture is respected, that we can feel safe within an aged care facility, that can do some very simple things, from having Aboriginal artwork to making sure that they get Aboriginal services involved in providing ongoing services for any mob that's there. So it's a whole range of things that they can do to make sure that our mob feel respected and feel comfortable within their service.
It's definitely worth learning more about what those things are. And I really like the fact, Bev, that, even those examples you were mentioning, things like including things in your environment, whether it be Aboriginal artwork or anchor plaque or, flags or whatever those things might be. Those might be really good cues to, for people to identify and demonstrate that a service is thinking about and focusing on their needs.
Yeah, really important for us because, our experience, Stein's experience was about denying our identity as Aboriginal people. Yeah, it was about making sure that our connections, our culture, that was lost. So we need to make sure that our mob feel that that's not going to happen again when they go into some institution, which they may think it is. We need to make sure that doesn't happen again, that they are included, they are respected, and they are acknowledged.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Bev. Frank, I was wondering if there's something in here. I mean, this is, again, there are enormous topics on this one slide, but I was wondering if there's something that really stands out to you in terms of why it's really important for aged care providers to understand the experience of people that have grown up in care and how that might shape the way that they work with services. Let
me reinforce what Valadia said about that sense of powerlessness and the lack of control over one's life. People talk about the lived experience and as if it's historical, but in fact, I prefer to talk about lived and living experience, because those things that happened in childhood, that sense of powerlessness, that sense of having no control over your life, lives on. You don't get over it as people expect you to do. So I think it's really important to understand the voicelessness of children. They had no parents to support them. If things went wrong, if things weren't, if they were not happy about things, if they were being abused or maltreated or neglected, there was no one to intervene. They were on their own, and that experience never leaves a person. You carry your history throughout the rest of your life. That sense of needing to be in control is really significant for most care leavers. I would generalize. I don't meet many care leavers who say, "Oh no, I'll let people control my life." They want to at least share the decisions that are being made about them, rather than submit to somebody controlling their lives, bossing them around, telling them what to do, when to do it, and so on. So I think it's really important to understand this is not just an individual psychological ploy on the part of a care leaver who enters an aged care facility or an aged care program. It's part of that drive to keep control, to take control and keep control of your life, so that people are not doing things to you, they're doing things with you.
Exactly. What Frank has said. People, any mob that's been in care, they want to have a say about what happens. They want to be involved in the decision making. They want to, make decisions, because that's what they've fought for. Once they left care, is to have that say and to have that power back, reclaim that power for themselves. So it is just so important for mob to have a say and be involved in decision making, even from the littlest things to the biggest things. You need to have a say. You need to have some sense of power over their lives.
Yes, that makes perfect sense. And I guess as providers, making sure that we're asking people what works for them in terms of making decisions and what, how we can best support them to have the information they need and feel like they're included, those kind of things be really important. I also really resonated with what you were saying, Frank, before about that experience. You don't get over it. It doesn't go away necessarily. Like I know in my own experience, I grew up in an environment of really significant family violence. And so that sense of safety is really important to me, and I imagine will shape, me moving forward. And it might be as simple as where I am in a room is important to me. So at the moment, because I'm able to independently make those decisions, I will always position myself in a space where I can see what's happening in a room, and I'll always know how to get out of a space. I don't need to talk to anyone about that because I can just make that happen without a conversation. But I wonder when, as I get older, if I wasn't able to communicate that, I think that might be something that was still really important to me. So, positioning me in a shared dining room, for example, with my back to all the action and what was happening could actually be really distressing to me potentially. That's not about being difficult. That's just shaped by my experience. Frank,
Just another example of that is queues. I am totally intolerant of queues. And that's because for more than 12 years, I queued up 3 or 4 times a day to do things in an institution. And I just cannot abide standing in a queue. So I'd rather wait till everything's finished and then be treated as an individual.
And the fact is that we all have those things that work for each of us, and some of them you might be more aware of and what shaped those things, and some you might not be as aware of and can just pop up over time, I guess. But when you are not in an opportunity to design your own life or make those choices, or people are coming in to do that for you, that is often the time where those things really come to the forefront.
It is so important in relation to stolen generations mob, need to know what the triggers are, because they're triggers that are going to unfortunately follow them because of what happened to them, because of the trauma, the abuse. They're going to follow them for the rest of their lives. So need to know what those triggers are.
I think it was Valadia last week that mentioned to me, you want to come with the solution, not just the problems. So I think that's always a really good rule of thumb when we're thinking about working with people. It's really valuable to understand what's important to people. And when we're thinking about triggers, what's really important is to understand what works for somebody. What do you need in that time? How can we best support you? And it might be in community services, for example, if someone's coming into your home, what's really important about the way that, staff might, do that and be in your home. So, coming with the solution, and just as all of those examples you guys have shared, people will usually know the solution for themselves. It's not about us having to come up with that. It's just about us respecting that.
One of the problems that many care leavers talk about is ever-changing environments. Some were shifted around among 8, 9, 10, even more institutions, attending many, many schools, never having the same social worker more than 2 or 3 months at a time. And that lack of stability lives on. So I'm a client of an in-home service, and I value continuity. I like to see the same person every fortnight. That's what happens in my case, and that's happened for the last 4 or 5 years. Prior to that, there were a number of changes, and you want to get to know people and build a rapport with them, so that you can work together on solving the problem that you're confronting. You don't want a constant turnover of staff and constant turnover of people that you have to get to know and to trust and respect. So I think that's really important.
One of the big things that I was finding often is I felt like I was being treated either like I had a disability, that I was dumb, or I was a child. And that's really, that's one of the main triggers. One, not the main triggers, but that is a big trigger. So inclusion, like the other two guys were saying, is being included in making those decisions, being respected as an adult who has, some needs, as we all do. But in my situation, when your rights were taken away and your control was taken away, that was followed by extreme physical, sexual abuse, and so the triggers are absolutely compounding. It's having respect and being treated as an equal. Yeah, and that's. And then the rest of it we can work through.
We owe that to everybody, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Sarah, I was just thinking, literally just wrote me a message about what I was going to ask you. Sarah, I just noted that there are a couple of dot points that relate to personal records and identity documents, for example. I was just wondering if you could speak really briefly to that before we move on.
Personal records are very important for care leavers. They quite often didn't have any identity records from birth. There are often very scant records available about their time in care. And so much of our identity is connected to our family and our origins, and many care leavers don't have that information. And also where those records do exist, sometimes they are inaccurate and full of untruths. Some people were told that their parents had passed away, and that wasn't the case. And so when people can access their records, they often find things that they didn't know about themselves or their own families. So, record keeping in moving into the aged care space is also very important, and it can be a sensitive issue for people. They want to know what's being written about them, what's being said about them, so they can connect and again have that choice and control over what's going on for their care.
Sarah's made a terrific point there. Many care leavers found out that there are records kept about them or made about them when they were children only in their 60s and 70s. And they've got those records and have been absolutely appalled at what they've found. The judgmental comments about them or their parents, the negativity, constantly presenting the child as a problem and never talking about any of their strengths or good points or achievements, so that and that reflects that powerlessness that I was talking about. Those records were never made with the intention the child should see them as adults, and they didn't involve the children. So critical incidents never reported the child's perspective. So my advice to people organising aged care services is get the person involved to help make the record. Make sure that they understand that what you're writing down is accurate and can be relied on and so on. One of the best stories I came across was aged care service provider realising the person was semi-literate at best, saying, would you like to fill out this form, or would you like to tell me what I should put in the form? So that you're actually guiding what goes into the record and knows what goes into the record. I think that's an excellent practice when people have literacy problems. So records are really important, and if we're making records about people, then the person concerned ought to know what's being kept and why and for what purpose and who else will see the record, and all of those questions that arise out of childhood record keeping malpractices.
What a great example of, again, another really simple way that we can support people in a way that's respectful and inclusive. I think that's a really good standard practice for everybody. It also raises for me, we create care plans with each person that we work with, and that's an excellent opportunity to provide the person, the choice around how we create that, what that looks like, how they want to put it together, etc. And just making sure that we are embedding that strengths-based approach. Anyone with a kind of health or clinical background, we are taught from day one to document things in a very deficits-based, jargony way. It is really drilled into us the whole time. So having to be really mindful of that and thoughtful about not just documenting problems and challenges, but thinking about the person as a whole and what works and what's important. We want to make sure that's reflected in our documentation. And again, those things are being reinforced through the quality standards. And, a lot of what we've talked about today has been making sure that all organisations are taking that trauma-aware and healing-informed approach to care. Is really essential and actually sets you up for success working with all people. Just want to acknowledge that if we are not understanding people's experiences and circumstances and who they are as individuals, then there is a really cascading effect and impact for everybody involved. Certainly, if we're not able to deliver person-centred, trauma-informed care to a person, it might mean that they're not receiving the kind of support that they need. They can disengage, not get outcomes. Bev spoke before about the fact that sometimes people will therefore be really waiting until they're in crisis and their needs are really significant and they have less choice about the type of care they might be able to access, which is obviously not what we're aiming for. I think as well, it can be really challenging for staff if we don't understand what works for somebody and what they need from us to be able to deliver that person-centred care, then it's really difficult to support people. So we need to make sure that we're collecting and using that information along the way. I want to really highlight as well that being inclusive is not dependent on disclosure. People don't need to tell us the ins and outs of their story. People very well may not feel comfortable talking about their experiences in out-of-home care or childhood or any kind of experience at the beginning. That does not absolve us of needing to deliver inclusive person-centred care for everybody. If we just focus on understanding what works for someone, you're still able to do that and hopefully create opportunities for people to share their story in a way that works for them when it works for them and they feel safe to do so. The other thing that I think is really important, big picture, is that if we as organisations don't understand people's experience, and for example, if we're not learning about the experience of forgotten Australians or survivors of the stolen generation, then those people can essentially become invisible within our system, so that we're not factoring in people's experiences into our planning and into our quality improvement and into our thinking, you know, about the way that we design and deliver and evaluate our services. We are all working in this space because we really care about delivering the best possible services to our community. And part of that is that we need to understand who our community is, and that is really diverse. So I think, we want to make sure that we equip ourselves to be understanding and then delivering safe and inclusive care. Wondering how you think an older person, you know, survivor of the stolen generation might look for clues or cues from an organisation that they were going to be able to deliver services that were safe and inclusive for them.
Going to a service and seeing that us as a people with a culture, how that is respected. So you mentioned before about having Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander flags flying. And you know, as soon as you see that on any service, we feel welcome straight away. And then going inside and seeing Aboriginal people represented through their art or photographs, with staff, having Aboriginal staff, having staff who have undergone cultural awareness training, because you can pick that up straight away too when you start talking to people. I think being listened to about, you know, what your needs are. No point having a plan if you're not going to be listened to. And if what you're saying isn't going to be acted upon.
Yes. So deliver, actually follow through.
And as I said too, about having Aboriginal community members, workers visiting, to talk to our mob and to provide ongoing service for them, even if they're in an aged care facility. That's what they're entitled to. Having speakers, having Aboriginal entertainment. So it's all sorts of things, you know, from commemorating NAIDOC Week and other Aboriginal days, you know, in the facility, because that's good for everyone. And these are things that are good for everyone. You know, we know that you know, the things that we've asked for, they've translated over to other people, you know, and made it a better life for them.
Almost like magic. You actually spoke really beautifully to many of the points that are actually criteria to be able to demonstrate evidence for the Specialisation Verification Framework, in terms of the environments, having Aboriginal staff, you know, supported as champions, remaining connected to community organisations. All of the physical environment, all of those things are the kind of things that providers can use as evidence as well for specialisation.
Having that connection to family, that is just so important for stolen generations mob, particularly. I'll give you an example of we organised a reunion for 4 elders. That one of them lived in Victoria, one of them lived in New South Wales, and one of them lived in remote New South Wales. So, and this was during COVID. So we thought, well, we want to do something for them because they're elderly. 2 of them had serious health issues. They were never going to, we were never going to be able to get them all together back home here on country. So we organised a Zoom reunion. We've never done that before, but we thought it was just so critical that we did something for this family. Yeah. So we were very grateful for the support that we received from the elder who was in an aged care facility. The nurse there, she just went above and beyond in supporting our client, to participate in this reunion on Zoom. So things like that, that's what we'd like to see.
And I love that, obviously COVID made us all be thinking more creatively, but there's not just one way to do it. Just, thinking creatively about different ways to connect people. It's really cool. Yeah. Fantastic. And that reminds me as well of the importance of understanding how different everybody's understanding about what health and wellbeing means to them is. And I know that in many Aboriginal communities, there's much more of that community focus on health and wellbeing, that rather than an individual focus, which might be more of a Western kind of approach. But, understanding that as a starting point is really key to being able to deliver care that's actually going to work for someone. Frank, did you want to add something about the kind of cues that forgotten Australians might potentially look for that a service was going to be safe?
Yeah, I like Bev's point about what works in Aboriginal communities will work across the board. I think the principles that they espouse and apply are really terrific general points about involvement, respect, showing the flag, etc., etc. My mind turns to how do people get involved in the aged care system in the first place? And I think word of mouth, and I'm sure Bev would agree with this, word of mouth is absolutely core. People talk among their own kind. We have care leaver meetings regularly across Australia, and whenever we talk about aged care, we talk about the triggers, and we talk about things like respect and how you're treated, and how care was not available to you as a child. And if it means the same, if the word care means the same thing now, then we don't want to have a bar of it. I'd rather die than go into an aged care facility. It's a common expression among care leavers. They talk about it all the time. I had 10 terrible years as a child. I don't want to have the last 10 years of my life experiencing similar things. So yes, it's hard to be particular about this, but general things like respect for the person, allowing them dignity, not being intrusive, all of those sorts of things are talked about. In the case of care leavers who grew up in religious institutions, notably Catholic institutions, and the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse gave the Catholics a bad report card. Then you're looking at things like calling I'm talking about institutions now, calling the institution by the same name as it was known as an orphanage. So St. Joseph's was a common place. If you're going to call an aged care facility St. Joseph's, then a lot of care leavers say, I'm not going there. If you put up crosses and pictures of religious figures, you're not going to have people go there. They'll trigger care leavers who experience that kind of brutality in religious institutions. But that's a particular case. I think we're talking mainly about, aren't we, today, in one's own home?
Yeah, in-home and community-based services.
Yeah, so it's that somebody who's polite and respectful, doesn't boss you around, doesn't tell you what they're going to do, but discusses what needs to be done and shares with you the way in which it's going to be done, I think is really important.
Sarah, I know we need to keep moving, but I just wanted to ask you one question around whether it be religious-based organisations or some of those larger institutions that were often involved in institutional care of children, and any special considerations or what that might mean, either more broadly for older people working with large institutions or those institutions specifically.
Mm. Look, I think Frank picks that up very well, the potential triggers that are around for people. Very often they'll be using the same buildings that are no longer used for institutional care for children, but they become, still owned by the faith-based organisation and used in their aged care service provision. So, that can be very triggering. On the other hand, it really is on the faith-based providers to make this right and to really open themselves up to learning from their role in the mistakes of the past and the wrongs of the past, and to be part of a healing, reconciled future where people can feel safe in any of these spaces. So I think, there's a real onus on aged care providers who are based in the faiths to do their best in this space to really open themselves up to that.
Yeah. And so I guess as a starting point, there's obviously lots of intricacy in learning how to do that. But as a starting point, understanding that even if you're not part of a faith-based organisation specifically, working with institutions, and whether it be government organisations, whatever it might be, that in itself can be really challenging for lots of people. And then being committed to doing that work and learning and understanding how you can support people, would be a really good starting point, I imagine. Just want to remind you that in terms of specialisation verification, there are lots of resources that are available on the Department of Health and Aged Care website, which again will obviously be in your resource list, but walk you through the application process for verification. I think perhaps one of the things that's really important to know is that you are required to provide evidence of the work that you're doing in this space. But it doesn't necessarily need to be a hugely onerous process. Lots of the work might be things that you're already doing and already kind of working towards, at least. Bev spoke to before some of those key ideas about what can create more inclusion in your services, and those are really reflected in the criteria. It takes about 4 weeks to go through the application process, and once you're verified, that information is then displayed on the Find a Provider tool, as we looked at before. I know that I spoke with someone at AHA recently, and they're certainly really encouraging and hoping to work with organisations around becoming verified and working with care leavers. But if you think about the kind of things we've talked about today about what could make that happen, I hope that many of those things resonate with the practices that you're already doing. There are a number of criteria specifically around becoming specialised in terms of working with care leavers. And you need to be able to provide evidence that you meet 4 of these criteria. So, as I said before, Bev spoke to a number of these beautifully before. Things like at least 90% of your staff completing ongoing training, and not that kind of tick and flick process, but really it's important to understand what that good quality training would look like. And that might be around delivering culturally competent services and culturally safe services. Trauma-informed care is a really important one, understanding the experience of care leavers generally. And then actively engaging and continuing to work with people who are experts in this space. So whether that be having a consumer advisory group, staff who identify as care leavers, becoming champions within your organisation, representation on your board, and making sure that your work is supported through policies and procedures right across your model of care that actually enable you to deliver care that is safe and inclusive. I spoke to you before about the follow-up activities today. really making sure that we're thinking about this work as part of our broader quality improvement process, and making sure all of our organisations, regardless of whether you pursue specialisation or not, that we continue to work towards delivering safe and inclusive services for everyone is incredibly important and all of our responsibility. That's not an optional extra. It's something that we must all be doing and demonstrating and having evidence that we're doing. We have 4 more of these workshops that will be rolling out over the next couple of months. I really encourage you to get involved and take part in that. And just to highlight as well that there are a number of support services available. So if anyone needs more support, you can absolutely contact these organisations.